Joining me now is Ambassador Paul Bremer. He was the U.S. presidential envoy to Iraq in 2003, 2004, and he played a major role there in the administration of the country during the early days of the war. Ambassador, thanks for joining us.
Nice to be with you.
Well, there we heard from our correspondent, fierce fighting, 3 fronts open, the international airport coming under fire as well. President Obama has sent a few hundred troops, diplomatic protection forces. There has been talk of special forces going in, but we haven't heard anything official. What should the president be doing?
Well, first, it's important to start with what is America's interest here. Most Americans are not anxious to get back into a war. America's interest was quite clearly identified by the president last Friday when he made his first statement, when he said it is not in our interest that the ISIS, the extremist terrorists, should get a foothold in Iraq. Well, they have more than a foothold at this point. They're controlling a fair amount of the country. So that's not in our interest, and we have to take steps to do something about it. What steps? Well, there are both military steps and political steps, and I'm hoping that very soon we'll see something concrete out of the White House.
You say that it's in the U.S. interest to do something about this because there's ISIS there. There was no Al-Qaeda, no ISIS in Iraq before the Americans invaded Iraq.
Well, actually, there was. There was an Al-Qaeda affiliate, in fact, in the calmest part of the country now, up in the Kurdistan. There was an Ansar in the Kurdish region. There was an Al-Qaeda group. They were quickly dealt with, in any case, by the Kurds, and now, as your correspondent pointed out, the Kurds have done a pretty good job.
But there was no support for Al-Qaeda from Saddam Hussein.
No, not that we learned of, anyway. That's correct.
You say the president should be announcing something. Should he be putting more troops in? Yes,
he should be putting, in fact, what he should be doing is putting boots on the ground. You know, everybody's gotten into this habit of saying no boots on the ground. There's a big difference between not having combat forces and not having boots on the ground. If we are going to achieve the military objectives that I think should be ours, and they are 2. 1, stop ISIS's program of moving to the south before they get to Baghdad. And now, as your correspondent pointed out, they seem to have arrived at the air base at Baquba. And 2, then helping the Iraqis recover their territory, which means fighting to liberate Tikrit, Mosul, Tal Afar. For both of those military operations, they're going to need American help, and American help is going to have to be in several areas. Number 1, intelligence, which means putting people on the ground, spotting the targets, fire control, basically, so that when you go in, particularly in the effort to retake the cities, you don't have indiscriminate bombing by manned aircraft. You're going to have to use drones.
Right.
So we will have to put some troops on the ground. They don't have to be combat forces. I suspect there'll be special forces and maybe some intelligence operatives.
But lives will still be at risk.
Of course.
Insofar as putting troops on the ground, the American people are not on your side. There was just a poll put out by the Pew Institute, which says that just over 50% of the U.S. says that it did not achieve its objectives in Iraq, and just over 50% as well say it was a mistake to get involved in the first place. There is no appetite for any kind of U.S. involvement. Well,
yeah, sure. I'm not familiar with any democracies that like to go to war, so it's to be expected that people will not want to go there. It's a question now of the president showing leadership and making the case that American interests are involved and will require more risk. It doesn't require combat forces.
The Washington Post is currently quoting military commanders as saying, because there's been a lot of talk about airstrikes on ISIS forces, and these military commanders quoted in the Washington Post say it would be risky, it would be complex, and it's questionable what they would achieve. We have Tulsi Gabbard, who's an Iraq veteran. She's a member of the House of Representatives right now for the Democrat Party, and she says, quote, it makes no sense, and she would oppose U.S. airstrikes.
I think you're talking about Representative Tammy Duckworth, who was actually one of my helicopter pilots when I was in Iraq.
Tulsi Gabbard said that as well.
Yeah. We basically succeeded in working with the Iraqi army in 2007 and 2008 and defeated al-Qaeda by providing exactly the kind of support that I think is necessary now. It can work. It is risky. There's no such thing as a risk-free war. The important point that needs to be emphasized is the American interests that are at stake here. And it is first and foremost a problem of one of the world's worst terrorist groups getting a base of operations in a failed state in the heart of the Middle East. This is not Afghanistan hidden behind the mountains somewhere. This is right in the heart of historic Arab world with a lot of wealth there. And these terrorists have a number of American citizens and citizens from West European countries with American passports or French or British passports, which makes it much harder in the end to control their movements. So there can be absolutely no question that we cannot allow that to happen. The president said that on Friday, and I agree with him.
Right, you're talking about a situation that exists right now, but there are critics, there are many in this country who would say you were part of an administration that created these conditions in the first place.
Yes, we threw out Saddam Hussein. That was our job, and we did it.
But now you have ISIS there.
Yeah, but the country won this war. By the end of 2009, Al-Qaeda was defeated. Iraq was at peace. The problems have arisen after those years, mostly in the last 3 years.
Ambassador, if we look at Iraq right now, it doesn't look like a country that's enjoying the fruits of a victory. You say it won the war.
Yeah, well, it did. It defeated Al-Qaeda.
But, I mean, does it look like it's enjoying the fruits of a victory right now?
No, of course not. Of course not, because we made the mistake of pulling our troops out at the end of 2011. We can relitigate all of the problems of the past. The problem right now that is faced by our country and by the Iraqis and by our friends in that neighborhood is whether we are going to allow a major Arab country to come under the control of an extremist Muslim terrorist group. That's what is at issue immediately. There is a broader issue, which is the collapse of the regional structure that's been in place for almost 100 years in that region. And that, of course, also needs to be addressed. But the immediate question is stopping the takeover of Iraq by one of the world's most extreme terrorist groups.
Right. You say we, meaning the United States, made the mistake of pulling out all U.S. troops. But surely that is not a decision for the United States to make. It's a decision for the Iraqis to make. And they made that decision. They said, we do not want American troops here.
Well, actually, it's much more complicated than that. Effectively, what the president did was put Prime Minister al-Maliki in an impossible situation. By the time we went to ask him to have a status of forces agreement, we had whittled down the number of Americans there to about a brigade. They would have been based, in fact, at the Bakuba Air Force Base that was referred to earlier by your correspondent. And their only job, with only 3,000, basically a brigade, would have been to protect themselves. It was a position that made it impossible for al-Maliki to say he would take it. Plus, we said to him, you have to get it approved by your parliament. Now, I've been involved in American foreign policy for almost a half a century. Since the Second World War, we've had status of forces agreements with something like 84 different countries. We never told a foreign country how they had to approve it. We did to Maliki. We made it impossible for him. We cut it way back. We said you have to have it approved by Parliament. And quite obviously, he put him in a position where he couldn't say...
but surely that's a good thing. That would have given him a great deal of legitimacy to say, I went to my Parliament, they approved it, and the American troops can stay. Well,
you can always discuss it. It came out exactly where I think the administration wanted it to come out. They were able to maneuver al-Maliki into a position that it was al-Maliki who said he didn't want the troops there, and they said, fine, we'll go home.
Okay, what do you make of the fact that the United States is now talking to Iran to get help from Tehran in resolving this crisis in Iraq?
Well, it's not clear exactly what we are talking to Iran about. I haven't been able to discern from the public statements exactly what they have in mind. They have apparently excluded having military coordination, which I think is right. I have some grave doubts about whether there really is a confluence of interest between ourselves and the Iranians. Not clear to me. Iran is the world's leading supporter of terrorism, including support for al-Qaeda over the years. In fact, the State Department annual report on counterterrorism fingered Iran directly for its support for terrorism, among others, for al-Qaeda and for the Iraqi Hezbollah. So I think there's a pretty limited range of what we can really talk to the Iranians about, frankly. And it's hard to tell what exactly the administration has in mind.
I mean, there are already reports that there are units of the Revolutionary Guard already in Iraq.
No, I wouldn't be surprised.
The Kurds have taken over control in parts of Iraq as well. Is there a danger here that Iraq's going to fracture into 3 separate autonomous regions?
Yeah, there is a danger, and that would be a real blow to Iraqi and American interests. I have said, and I repeat, that I think the fundamental American interest, assuming we can get rid of this al-Qaeda crowd, is a stable, unified, and democratic Iraq. And I believe that is still in our interest.
The United States President Barack Obama has said we're not going to be sending troops, putting troops on the ground, their boots on the ground, as it said. And he's linked something to American help. He says, look, we're prepared to help. If Nouri al-Maliki will start talking to his enemies, start talking to the Sunnis in Iraq, get to some point where there will be reconciliation, then there might be more American help.
Well, that goes back to my point about the price we paid for withdrawing our troops, because basically our troops always had a political purpose in Iraq, and the political purpose was to give us leverage, give us a place at the table. When we pulled out, al-Maliki basically started an anti-Sunni campaign. He started pestering the Kurds. He put out an arrest warrant for his vice president. And most important to today's events, he started a comprehensive purge of the officers we had trained in the Iraqi army. So the president is right that what we should be looking for now is a more broad-based Iraqi government. They just had an election. They were already in the process.
So you agree with the president on that?
I agree with him on that, yeah. I think that's important.
Okay. Looking at your own role when you were ambassador or at least you were the representative of the United States in Iraq, in retrospect, was it a mistake to disband the army?
No, I don't think so. There's a lot of mythology around about it. There are sort of three or four points. First of all, there was no army to disband. They had basically all gone home. The question was, should we recall the army? Mm-hmm. We decided we would not do that. Secondly, we put on pension all of the Iraqi officers, gave them a pension that was more than they were going to get under Saddam, and we paid off all of the draftees. Thirdly, we said that when we set up the new army, anybody from the old army up to the level of colonel was welcome to join. And when I left, 75% of the officers and NCOs in the new army were, in fact, from the old army. So I don't doubt that some of the members of the old army joined the Sunni resistance, not al-Qaeda, but the Sunni resistance that got involved in the post-2006 uprising. But no, it was the right thing to do, and we created an effective army that actually, with our help, defeated al-Qaeda there by 2009, as I said earlier.
When you sit here now and you look at what's going on in Iraq, you've got something just over 4,000 American troops killed, thousands more injured.
Right.
The range and the number of Iraqis killed range from 150,000, some estimates say 650,000. Great damage done to the country. Do you have any regrets about those decisions that were taken more than 10 years ago?
Well, the decision to overthrow Saddam was the right decision. There's no, in my view, no question about that. He was running the most brutal dictatorship in the region. We thought, as did the French, the Germans, the Russians, and the British, that he was still working on his weapons of mass destruction. We found no evidence of that, as it turns out, though we do know that he kept in place, we know from the debriefings we had with his people, he kept in place the personnel, the programs, to restart it right away. So we would be in a much worse position today if we had a nuclear-armed Iraq facing what would now be also a nuclear-armed Iran, because the Iranians would have continued their program. So I think on the whole, it was the right decision. I'm sure we made mistakes. There's no doubt about that. Disbanding the army was not a mistake.
Ambassador Bremer, thanks for joining us.
Nice to be with you.